This morning, though, more than 8,000 U.S. troops are now on heightened alert, with fears rising that Russia could invade Ukraine.
So far, no troops have been deployed, but the U.S. and its NATO allies are stepping up their response, hoping to discourage Russia from crossing the Ukrainian border. Right now, more than 100,000 Russian troops are along the border of Ukraine. With no diplomatic breakthrough in sight, the U.S. and other Western countries are preparing for the worst-case scenario.
We hope it doesn't come to that, of course. But if Mr. Putin has designs beyond Ukraine, if he intends to threaten the NATO alliance, we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that can't happen, and that the alliance and our alliance partners can defend themselves.
President Biden spent part of his Monday in the Situation Room speaking with European leaders. The president says everyone is on the same page about trying to come to a peaceful resolution with Russia. Let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee and NBC News reporter Matt Bodner, who is in Moscow. Matt, going to start with you. Russia's presence along the Ukrainian border is growing. So what's the latest on the ground there, and any signs, any signals that Vladimir Putin is close to making a decision on whether to invade?
Joe, good morning. All right, so let's start with these troops and throw up the big board. Obviously, Russia has already amassed a significant share of its ground forces. Also, air forces, we're seeing a lot of, or a decent amount of Russian naval activity as well. You know, one of the things that's caught my eye is that the Russian Navy, not pictured on the map, but off the coast of Ireland, has scheduled an exercise, a live fire exercise about 250 kilometers off the coast of Ireland. That's drawing some attention. I actually read a story in the Irish Observer this morning that Irish fishermen are planning on going out there for a peaceful protest when this starts. I'm sure the Kremlin didn't anticipate that move, but much more seriously, we continue to see evidence on social media that Russia is moving troops still west to those positions along the Ukrainian border. A lot of those are happening in the open, part of exercise plans, they say, with Belarus scheduled to kick off next week. Another development this morning is the Latvian military is claiming that 4 arms inspectors who are supposed to go and do some inspections of that exercise under the Vienna document, which calls for transparency, if an exercise reaches a certain scale, the Russian military, they say, denied them, citing COVID-19 protection measures. So, you know, Russia is sitting there saying its troops moving on their territory is their own business and is not threatening anyone, but it's kind of a strange move with that regard. More to your point on Vladimir Putin, we are expecting sometime this week the United States to deliver a formal response to Russia's laundry list of demands. And I think, you know, Russia's just kind of in a holding pattern now, waiting for that list, for that response. Once it happens, things will be a lot clearer. But until then, I would argue almost nothing we hear from Russia actually matters at the moment.
So, Carol, in the meantime, 8,500 U.S. troops are now on high alert to help NATO as things continue to de-escalate. No deployment orders yet. President Biden spoke with European and NATO leaders yesterday afternoon. What are you learning about that meeting, and what other support are the U.S. and NATO providing right now?
Yeah, Joe, as Vladimir Putin aligns his troops along the border and decides what he's going to do, the White House, the president, and European leaders are trying to get on the same page in terms of how they would respond to any movement across the border into Ukraine. So the president had a virtual meeting with a number of European leaders, key leaders from Poland, Italy, the UK, Germany, France, the EU. And that meeting lasted about an hour and 20 minutes, according to the White House. Now, the White House came out of that meeting saying that everyone's on the same page in terms of steps that would be taken if Putin were to invade Ukraine again. However, we know there are big differences, and meanwhile, they're all just really trying to figure out and game out what exactly Vladimir Putin is going to do. They still don't have a full grasp on that. Take a listen to the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki talk about this yesterday.
While we can't get into the mind of President Putin, we are seeing the preparations that they're making at the border. We have been in conversations and discussions with Eastern flank countries. Obviously, our Secretary of State just returned from a trip to Europe as well, and he was part of the discussions this weekend, too. And part of that has been contingency planning and discussing what their needs have been.
Now, it's worth noting that none of these troops that are on standby are slated to go to Ukraine, but the U.S. does continue to send military aid to Ukraine, Joe.
Matt, what has been the reaction from Ukrainian and Russian leaders with more military help from NATO now on standby?
So the Ukrainian reaction is kind of conflicted. On the one hand, they're downplaying the Russian threat from certain areas in Kyiv. On the other hand, they definitely are raising awareness. They're in a tough spot. If they do too much right now, they could risk actually provoking a Russian invasion. They could also scare away foreign investors and such. So it's a difficult position for Ukraine. Russia, of course, very predictably is looking at all the movements from NATO now and saying that's exactly what we're talking about. NATO is trying to provoke something. They're trying to encourage Ukraine to attack eastern Ukraine. So that's basically the situation now.
Matt Bodner, Carol Lee, thank you so much.
Now, this morning, investors will be hoping for some calm after Monday's roller coaster day of trading. All major U.S. indexes plunged early in the day yesterday, then rebounded. The Dow Jones had dropped more than 1,000 points before things turned around. Here to help us make sense of the latest market jitters is CNBC senior national correspondent Brian Sullivan. Brian, good morning. I mean, it really was a roller coaster. So walk us through what we saw on Wall Street yesterday. What led to this massive sell-off in the stocks? Why yesterday? And then that eventual rebound by the end of the day. How'd that happen?
Well, a lot of it had to do with what you all just talked about, which is Russia, Ukraine. There's a lot of geopolitical tension in the world right now, not just because of the strategic importance of Ukraine and so many things, but because Russia is such a massive supplier of power and energy to most of Europe. Germany gets over 35% of its natural gas, oil, and coal, the things that make the power plants work, from Russia. So there's a lot of tension around what might happen if Russia goes in. How will Europe respond? How will we respond? The Pentagon putting 8,500 U.S. troops on deployment, potential for deployment there. So that is one major thing. Also, you've got the Federal Reserve, which is meeting today and tomorrow. They are expected widely to raise interest rates multiple times this year to try to cool down inflation. I'm sure you guys have talked about inflation a lot, constantly rising prices. One way to control that is to try to put the brakes on the economy, slow things down just a bit. The Federal Reserve doing that by raising borrowing costs, things like mortgages or credit card rates or car loans. Just raise them a little bit, guys, so that they slow down. The confusion is how many times the Fed will do that and whether or not they will be able to sort of weave that needle, that delicate needle thread through this economy, guys. And that's the question about what happened in that furious comeback as well. Yeah. Find somebody that takes both sides today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have these big issues, Ukraine, prospect of interest rate hikes by the Fed. Are these concerns, though, overblown as those things maybe stabilize a little bit more, or should investors be worried about all this up and down?
It's a good question. I mean, listen, Russia and Ukraine have had problems for a while. In fact, I was in Russia in 2014 when they effectively annexed the Crimean portion of southern Ukraine and still control that today. So this has been going on for some time. And I say that not because it's not huge, but because it should not be new. It's only just ratcheted up in the last couple of weeks. The Federal Reserve, we've known they're going to do this. I think here's the reality, guys. The market has done fantastic the last number of years. A lot of people made a lot of money. They've been gambling on these beaten up stocks. They've been buying things like Bitcoin and Ether. The market, as many might say, got a bit frothy. Money was cheap. You could borrow money for just a couple of % interest, if that. So cheap money combined with a lot of speculation. There's been a lot of, dare I say, gambling going on in the market. And in the last couple of weeks with the nerves on high, some of that gambling has been pulled back. But overall, I think the economy is still very strong, and we'll see where this market goes from here.
And Brian, quickly before I let you go, what advice would you give to investors right now who just saw what happened yesterday and aren't sure how to handle it?
Think long term. Markets go down, and that's healthy. Healthy corrections are a part of this market. Markets going up every day are when you need to be worried. It's okay to go down. Don't sell into the panic. Think long term. Markets go up 75% of the time.
Brian, great advice there. Good for me to hear myself, too. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Some mixed news this morning on the coronavirus pandemic. COVID cases are dramatically falling in some regions of the country, while others are seeing a dangerous spike. Take a look at this map, which is based on an NBC News analysis of COVID-19 case number data. All those states in orange are no longer experiencing a surge in cases, but all the other states you see in gray are still surging. And at this rate, Dr. Anthony Fauci says he expects most states to reach a peak in Omicron cases by February. Here to help break down what this means moving forward is NBC News medical contributor Dr. Kavita Patel. So, Dr. Patel, this looks like a hopeful sign that we may have turned the corner with Omicron or are close to turning the corner, but we shouldn't let our guard down right now, right?
Right. That's right, Joe, because coming down, there's still a lot of cases. And as you mentioned, many parts of the country are still going up in their swing. And unfortunately, hospitalizations will follow.
So, Dr. Patel, this morning, NBC News learned that Pfizer will begin to test an Omicron COVID-19 vaccine for people between the ages of 18 and 55. So by now we've learned it takes time to test and eventually approve a vaccine. So why is this happening? Do we need a vaccine specifically for Omicron, especially if it's not available right away?
Yeah, Joe, it's a significant development. Both Moderna and Pfizer announced that they were working on something. Today, we got the most details from Pfizer. By the way, changing an mRNA vaccine doesn't take as long as one might think. It's like changing the contents of a FedEx package. It's very important, but the outside of the package is still the same one. So it can take several months, but that's a very short time frame. It's important to do this because we need to understand if Omicron does become really the dominant variant in the world and our current vaccines are decreased in its effectiveness, having one that's updated will give us a lot more information and could be incredibly useful if it continues to hang around and cause surges in the future.
Helpful analogy with the FedEx package there. All right, let's get to a viewer question. Matt from New Mexico writes, at the beginning of the pandemic, quarantine was 14 days. Why or how has that turned into 5 days quarantine? And should that be 5 days with the mask? What can you say to Matt about that?
Yeah, so Matt, you're bringing up an important distinction. I want to just say that if you're fully vaccinated and boosted, you don't really need to do anything different other than wear a mask. And if possible, try to get a test. That's me adding on to the CDC. But to Matt's point, if you are not boosted, you've just had that primary series, or you're unvaccinated, they do recommend a 5-day quarantine. And that is also with a mask. And that is because in those first 5 days, that's the highest infectious period. It doesn't mean it drops to zero, but it's the most vulnerable time and the time in which you're most likely to test positive.
All right. Dr. Patel, thank you so much. I know our viewers appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who has been sending in questions for our doctors. We do want to hear from you, and our doctors are ready to answer your questions. You can email us at morningnewsnow@nbcuni.com with your questions, and you can always let us know if you'd prefer to stay anonymous.
Healthcare workers are fighting this latest COVID wave with more tools than they've ever had before. That includes those antiviral pills that President Biden touted in his news conference last week.
Now we have more treatments that people can, for people to keep people out of the hospital than any other point in the pandemic, including life-saving antiviral pills. We purchased 20 million of these new Pfizer pills, more than any country in the world.
NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber joins us now in New York. Ellison, good morning. So these pills can be very effective according to this data. And as we just heard, the president says we have more of these COVID pills than any other country, tens of millions of them. But tracking them down seems to have been a problem for some people. I mean, there's not the access that there is with vaccines or tests in terms of a tool to fight this virus. So tell us what's going on and how hard they have been to find.
Hey, Savannah. Yeah, I mean, you're right. This does seem to be a very effective tool in terms of dealing with COVID-19. But the problem seems to be that the demand for these treatments, it far outweighs and exceeds the supply that is currently available. We've spoken to people who say as they've gone to speak to doctors or even pharmacists, they've had some of those people say they, one, don't know where they could find them, and two, sometimes they don't know exactly what they are. Now, why all of this is such a struggle at this point is a little harder to explain, and it's a bit of a multi-layered issue here. These treatments, they are approved under emergency use authorizations. And what we've been told by representatives from the two companies that produce these treatments, Pfizer and Merck, is that they produce them, they distribute them, give them to the U.S. government. But then in terms of how they're divided, divvied up between states, who gets priority, and communication as to where they are located, what specific pharmacies have them, all of that, they say, is something that is under the federal government's jurisdiction if you will. Let me explain to you, or break down for you rather, some of the numbers in terms of how many COVID pill treatments are out there right now. Pfizer says 250,000 treatment courses will be delivered to the U.S. government by the end of the month. 10 million treatment courses, they say, are expected to ship to the U.S. government by June. Merck, the other company that produces these types of pills, they say 2 million of their treatment courses have shipped to the U.S. government so far, and 3.1 million courses are expected to ship to the U.S. government by the end of this month. Doctors we've spoken to, they are optimistic when it comes to these pills, but they are urging patients, saying that it takes time to produce this sort of thing in general, that it's out, they say, quicker than expected. And one thing doctors we spoke to kept saying is, remember, 2 years ago, there were not any outpatient treatment options for their COVID patients. Here's more.
Production has been ramped up, and I think there'll be more supply, and I think the government is trying to ensure that there's enough supply. But I think these drugs are not easy to produce. It's going to take some time. The good news is that we have them. The good news is that Omicron, the mutations in Omicron don't impact those drugs. Those drugs are still effective. The bad news is we simply don't have enough of those drugs.
And let's talk eligibility in terms of these pills. For Merck, the minimum age is 18 years. You need to initiate that treatment course within 5 days of symptoms. They say their treatment is not recommended during pregnancy. For Pfizer, Paxlovid treatment, which had higher rates of efficacy in some of the early studies, it has more restrictions. The minimum age is 12, and you have to be at least 88 pounds, initiated within 5 days of symptoms. But they have a very long list of interactions, potential interactions of other medications people might be taking that limits eligibility there. But the big thing, Savannah, for both of these, you have to have a prescription from a doctor.
Well, it's interesting even to hear some of the details there, because as these are just kind of starting to become accessible, we haven't heard a lot about exactly how these work, how many pills you're taking. So that's interesting to hear. What have people who have been trying to track down these pills, who either have a family member experiencing it, maybe they're sick themselves, what have they been telling you about trying to get them?
Yeah, we talked to one family, a son whose mother lives in the Houston area. She is triple vaxxed but immunocompromised. And when she contracted COVID-19, he'd heard about these new COVID pills, and he told her, hey, you need to talk to your doctor and see if you can get these. But she says when she went and spoke to her doctor, he said, if you can find them somewhere, I'll write you a prescription. But I can't do that legwork for you, and I don't know any pharmacies that have that. Her son then went on an hours-long search to try and find them. Listen.
I ended up calling 12 pharmacies and getting all different kinds of answers about whether or not the pill was available, whether or not they could tell me if they had it. Many had not heard of it at all, or are unfamiliar with any antiviral. For it to be as effective as it can be, it needs to be taken within the first 5 days of symptoms, and those days were running out, waiting on clearance and prescription and information.
So there is a website the health department has where you can go, and it's an interactive map to see exactly which pharmacies in your area might have some of these pills available. We'll show you what that looks like on the screen here, because it's a little challenging, quite frankly, to get to the website. The entire URL for it is too long for us to even put up on screen. I think we can post it on Twitter and our social media platforms. But if you search for the COVID-19 therapeutics locator, you or your provider, in theory, you can access it through healthdata.gov and kind of get a real-time look at where some of these COVID pills are available. But people, they tell us, Savannah, they wish it was a little bit easier to find that and to navigate this system. Savannah.
Absolutely. You hear those stories of pharmacies not even knowing what people are talking about. It's very confusing. All right, Ellison Barber, we'll check out your Twitter for that information. Thank you so much.
The Supreme Court is adding affirmative action to the list of high-profile issues justices plan to tackle this term. The court has agreed to hear legal challenges to the admissions process at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. The cases could alter college admissions as we know it, presenting the most serious threat to affirmative action in decades. Here's NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams.
This is the most serious threat in decades to the practice of considering a student's race in college admissions, and it could result in a decision that bans the practice or at least scales it back. The court agreed to hear 2 cases challenging race-conscious admissions, one at a private school, Harvard, the other at a public one, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Opponents say both Harvard and UNC discriminate against Asian American applicants and that UNC also discriminates against whites. The Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled, most recently 6 years ago, that schools cannot use quotas to meet racial admissions goals, but can consider a student's race as one plus factor among many other qualities in helping schools achieve the educational benefits of a more diverse student body. But the challengers say that's a vague concept. They say if schools want diversity, they should consider a student's background and experiences directly without using race as a proxy for those factors. 2 justices who ruled in favor of affirmative action in the past, Anthony Kennedy and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, are now gone, succeeded by Trump appointees Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. They haven't written much about affirmative action as lower court judges, so their views are not well known, but it's likely they'll be more skeptical than Kennedy and Ginsburg were. The court will hear the case in its next term, which begins in October. Back to you.
P. Williams, thanks so much. Let's get a check on your morning news now weather.
Which means it's time for Bill Cairns to join us this morning. Hi, Bill.
Hey, good morning, guys. So we got a lot to talk about. So it's kind of quiet and it's very cold. And then we got this potential weekend snowstorm, especially for New England on Saturday. So we're going to talk more about that in depth next hour. Let's start with the weather that's of greatest concern. And that's going to be the snowy weather in the Midwest and the brutal cold that's moved in behind it. In Chicago, you know, it was your typical 2 to 4 inches of kind of fluffy snow. It wasn't really hard to brush off the car and move around. Gary, Indiana had 6 inches of snow, one of the highest totals in the region. And so that set the stage for this morning, and I hope you got out and cleaned everything up because a lot of that slush is now rock hard as the really bitter cold has moved in. We could have wind chills this morning as low as -50. I mean, that's like very, even for Minnesota, that's dangerous. 13 million people are under wind chill advisories, and let's see who the coldest is right now. Minneapolis actually is even colder than International Falls. -28 right now in Minneapolis. Green Bay's down to -20. Chicago -9. And that cold Arctic air is on its way through the Ohio Valley. It'll arrive in the Northeast tonight, so it's not exactly warm this morning in the Northeast, but enjoy it while it lasts because tomorrow is going to be much colder. So the Arctic Express, temperatures are definitely about 10 to 15 degrees colder than normal in the Midwest. Minneapolis, 25 degrees colder. Then tomorrow, as advertised, that cold air spreads all the way to Dallas, Raleigh, New York. And this weekend, that cold is going to linger. And guys, if you're going to get a snowstorm, it has to be cold enough, right? So that cold air is in place in the Northeast. We'll talk a lot more next hour about, you know, the potential for, you know, a nor'easter, maybe a blizzard. Could be a serious storm.
All right.
Yeah.
Ooh, all right.
Stay tuned for that. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.